Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going on a journey through the entire history of music, from the very first sounds humans ever made, all the way to the music you're listening to right now. This one's a big topic, so make sure you're sitting comfortably, grab a drink, and stick around till the end. If you enjoy deep dives like this, consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss the next one. Alright, let's rewind time and start at the very beginning. Let's go back. Not centuries, tens of thousands of years. Long before writing, before agriculture, before cities, humans were already making music. In 1995, deep in a cave called Divj Babe in modern-day Slovenia, archaeologists found a strange object resting beside an ancient fireplace. It was the hollowed-out leg bone of a cave bear, with 4 neat holes carved into it. It's known today as the Neanderthal flute, the oldest known musical instrument in the world and the strongest evidence we have that Neanderthals made music. Some researchers still argue it could simply be a bone gnawed by a hyena, but most agree the spacing and shape of the holes are far too deliberate for that. Based on the layer it was found in, this flute is somewhere between 50 and 60,000 years old. And it wasn't alone. In a different cave system, the Swabian Jura in southern Germany, archaeologists uncovered a whole family of flutes, carved from the wing bones of vultures and the ivory of woolly mammoths. These instruments, made of bone and ivory, are some of the earliest known musical instruments and clear proof of music in prehistoric life. One of them, the now famous Hole-Fels flute, was carved with real craftsmanship. 5-finger holes, a precisely shaped mouthpiece, made from the hollow wing bone of a griffon vulture, and originally about 13 inches long. So why does this matter? Because it tells us something important: music isn't a modern luxury. It's ancient, arguably older than agriculture, older than the wheel, maybe even older than language as we know it. Some researchers go further, suggesting that this kind of ritual music might have helped early humans maintain larger social bonds and networks. In other words, music wasn't just art. It was glue. It held tribes together. Before melody, though, there was rhythm. Long before anyone carved a flute, humans were almost certainly clapping, stomping, and striking sticks and stones together, the most basic form of percussion there is. Early rhythm likely mimicked the heartbeat, footsteps, the pulse of walking and working. It became part of ritual, dances around fires, chants before a hunt, sounds used to mark a birth, a death, a victory, a warning. Music in this era wasn't entertainment in the way we think of it today, it was survival. It synced people's movements during labor, calmed infants, intimidated rivals, and bonded communities tightly enough to survive in a hostile world. Then came civilization, and with it, music became something else, a tool of religion, power, and order. In ancient Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, archaeologists have found lyres dating back thousands of years, some buried in royal tombs alongside kings, suggesting music was considered important enough to carry into the afterlife. Sumerian and Babylonian texts even describe musical scales and tuning systems, some of the earliest written music theory in human history. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, music was deeply tied to religion and the cosmos. Harps, lyres, sistrums, a kind of ancient rattle used in worship of the goddess Hathor, and early flutes accompanied temple rituals, royal processions, and funerary rites. Egyptian tomb paintings even show musicians performing for pharaohs, proof that music had become a marker of status as well as spirituality. And then, in ancient Greece, music took a dramatic turn, it became philosophy. The mathematician Pythagoras is credited with discovering that musical harmony could be explained through numbers, that certain string length ratios produced pleasing, consonant tones, while others didn't. This was revolutionary. For the first time, music wasn't just felt, it was studied, measured, theorized. Out of this came the Greek modes, early scale systems with names like Dorian, Phrygian, and Lydian, each believed to evoke a different emotional or moral effect on the listener. The Greeks believed music could shape character itself, which is why it became a core part of education alongside mathematics and philosophy. So by the close of the ancient world, music had already traveled an enormous distance, from a hollowed bare bone beside a Neanderthal fire, to a mathematically structured art form debated by philosophers in Athens. And this was only the beginning. By the early Middle Ages, music had a new home, the church. And it's here, inside cold stone cathedrals and quiet monasteries, that one of the most important developments in musical history quietly took shape, the ability to write music down. This music is known as Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory I, during whose papacy it was collected and codified. It was monophonic, meaning a single melodic line, sung without instruments, often by choirs of monks. It was traditionally sung by choirs of men and boys in churches, or by women and men of religious orders in their chapels. For centuries, this chant survived purely through memory and oral tradition, passed from monk to monk, generation to generation. But memory is fragile. So sometime around the 9th century, musicians began using symbols called neumes, initially just memory aids showing the rise and fall of the voice. At first these were simple marks scratched above the words, no lines, no staff, just rough shapes implying, the melody goes up here or down here. These early neumes acted like prompts for melodies that singers had already memorized, rather than giving exact pitches. Then, in the early 11th century, an Italian monk named Guido of Arezzo changed everything. Guido of Arezzo, an expert in Gregorian chant, wrote a treatise explaining how to arrange these neumes on a set of horizontal lines, where each line represented a specific pitch. This was the birth of the musical staff, the ancestor of the same 5-line system used in sheet music today. For the first time in human history, a musician could look at a page and sing a melody they had never heard before. Music had become readable. While monks were notating sacred music, something very different was happening outside the church walls, in the courts and castles of medieval France. Here, traveling poet-musicians known as troubadours emerged, performing songs not about God, but about romantic love, chivalry, and courtly life. Unlike the anonymous chant composers of the church, troubadours were often named, individual artists, some of them even nobility. They sang in vernacular language rather than Latin, accompanying themselves on instruments like the lute or viol, an early bowed string instrument. This was, in many ways, the birth of secular music as we'd recognize it, music made not for ritual, but for storytelling and entertainment. Meanwhile, back in the cathedrals, composers were experimenting with something radical. What if you layered more than one melody at the same time? This was the beginning of polyphony, multiple independent melodic lines sung simultaneously, replacing the single unified voice of chant. Early polyphony, known as organum, started simply, just two voices moving in parallel. But over the following centuries, it grew dramatically more complex, with composers weaving 3, 4, even more interlocking vocal lines into intricate musical architecture. This shift fundamentally changed what music could be, no longer a single line of melody, but a structure, almost like a cathedral built from sound. By the time the Renaissance arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, polyphony had matured into something extraordinarily refined. Choral music reached new heights of complexity and beauty, with composers like Palestrina and Josquin des Prez crafting masses and motets where multiple voices blended in rich, balanced harmony, a style still studied by music students today as a model of vocal perfection. And outside the church, instrumental music was flourishing too. The lute became the defining instrument of the Renaissance courts, elegant, intimate, capable of both accompanying singers and standing alone as a solo voice. Alongside it came the viol, the recorder, and early keyboard instruments, as music increasingly moved out of purely religious spaces and into homes, courts, and public life. By the close of the Renaissance, music had transformed almost beyond recognition from where we left it in the ancient world. It now had a written language. It had complex harmony. It had professional composers, secular love songs, and instruments built specifically for entertainment rather than ritual. The stage was set for an explosion of structure and grandeur, the Baroque era. By the year 1600, music entered a new era, one historians call the Baroque, a word borrowed from the Portuguese term for an oddly shaped, overly ornamented pearl. Critics in the 19th century coined the term to describe the music of Bach and Handel's era as overly ornamented and exaggerated, and honestly, that description fits. Baroque music was bold, dramatic, layered, and dazzlingly complex. This was the era when tonality as we now understand it, major and minor keys, became firmly established, replacing the older modal system inherited from the Renaissance. Composers wrote melodies based on this new major and minor tonality, while the old Renaissance modes faded into the background. Baroque composers loved contrast, loud sections crashing suddenly into quiet ones, rather than smooth gradual changes in volume, and they loved counterpoint, multiple melodic lines woven together with mathematical precision. No one mastered this more than Johann Sebastian Bach. Working largely as a church organist and choir director in Germany, Bach received his earliest musical training from his father, later studying with his brother and at several schools before landing his first official post as an organist in his early 20s. Bach didn't invent counterpoint, but he perfected it. His fugues, built on systematic imitation between interweaving melodic lines, set the benchmark for musical craftsmanship that composers still study today. Meanwhile, in Venice, a red-haired, violin-trained priest named Antonio Vivaldi was reshaping a different form entirely, the concerto. Vivaldi was the best-known Italian composer of the early 18th century, known today primarily for his concertos, and remarkably, he spent much of his career working at a Venetian orphanage for girls, where he led one of the best orchestras in Europe, made up entirely of orphan girls and young women. Vivaldi essentially standardized the concerto structure, a single soloist set against a full ensemble, in a three-movement form, fast, slow, fast, a format still used in concertos today. Baroque music also gave the world entirely new genres: opera, with its blend of music and theatrical storytelling, the oratorio, a large-scale dramatic work for choir and orchestra, often on religious themes, and the instrumental suite. Perhaps the single greatest musical development of the entire period was the creation of opera itself, a genre that would go on to dominate musical culture for centuries. But by the mid-1700s, tastes were shifting. Audiences began to find Baroque music's dense complexity exhausting. They wanted something lighter, clearer, more elegant, and so the classical period was born. This is where Joseph Haydn enters the story. Often called the architect of the symphony, Haydn refined sonata form, the foundation of the classical symphony's first movement, creating clear contrasts between themes and structuring movements with a strong, logical sense of progression. Under Haydn, the symphony transformed from light courtly background music into a substantial, sophisticated art form in its own right. He also expanded what an orchestra could sound like, gradually incorporating trumpets, timpani, and more woodwinds to enrich the overall texture. Then came Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a child prodigy who, by the time he was an adult, had already mastered nearly every musical genre of his era. Mozart composed over 600 works across his short life, including landmark operas, symphonies, concertos, and chamber music, becoming known for his extraordinary melodic gift and technical mastery. Where Haydn built the architecture of classical form, Mozart filled it with effortless elegance and emotional nuance, clarity without sacrificing depth. Together, Haydn and Mozart helped cement what's now called the classical orchestra and the modern symphonic structure, a standard four-movement form, alternating fast, slow, dance-like, and lively finale movements, a template that composers would build on for the next 2 centuries. The string quartet also rose to prominence during this period, alongside the solo concerto, which increasingly emphasized a single performer's virtuosity rather than groups of soloists trading off, as had been common in the Baroque concerto grosso. So in the span of roughly 150 years, music traveled from the dense, ornamented grandeur of Bach's fugues to the balanced, transparent elegance of Mozart's symphonies. Structure had triumphed, form, clarity, proportion. But that calm wouldn't last. Waiting just around the corner was a composer who would shatter the polite boundaries of the classical era completely, and drag music into a new age of raw human emotion, Beethoven. If the classical era was about balance and clarity, the next era would tear that rulebook apart, and the man who lit the fuse was a temperamental, increasingly deaf composer from Bonn, Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven studied under Haydn himself, inheriting the polished structures of the classical era. But he wasn't content to stay inside them. Almost single-handedly, Beethoven built a bridge from the classical era of Mozart and Haydn into the Romantic era, becoming a pivotal figure who transformed the art form. What made him different wasn't just technical innovation, it was emotional honesty. As he gradually lost his hearing, rather than retreating, he poured his emotional and even depressed state directly into his music, which led to some of the most powerful works ever composed. Musically, Beethoven's late string quartets and symphonies, including his ninth, showcase emotional range and complex harmonic language that move well beyond traditional classical forms, through devices like innovative chromatic harmonies that marked a clear departure from classical tradition. He kept the architecture Haydn and Mozart had built, but he stretched it: bigger orchestras, longer pieces, more dramatic contrasts, music that didn't just please the ear but unsettled and moved the listener. This shift helped pave the way for the overtly emotional works that would follow from composers like Berlioz, Chopin, Liszt, and Tchaikovsky. And that's exactly what happened next. The Romantic era, roughly spanning the 19th century, made emotion the entire point of music. Romantic composers prioritized emotional depth and individuality over strict formal structure, experimenting with new harmonies, instrumental colors, and forms to create music of far greater variety and scale than the classical era typically allowed. Frédéric Chopin became the era's great poet of the piano. He revolutionized piano composition, creating works of unprecedented emotional depth and technical sophistication. His nocturnes, etudes, ballades, and polonaises permanently changed the face of piano music and remain central to the instrument's repertoire today. Meanwhile, across Europe, music became entangled with national identity. Composers began weaving folk melodies and national pride into their work, rejecting a one-size-fits-all European style. In Russia, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky emerged as a towering figure of this movement, bringing Russian music to international prominence through intensely emotionally charged symphonies and crowd-pleasing ballets like Swan Lake and the Nutcracker, blending Russian folk influences with Western technique into a powerful and distinctly romantic voice. By the close of the 19th century, Romantic music had pushed orchestras to enormous size, harmony to its emotional limits, and melody to operatic heights. It felt, to many at the time, like music couldn't possibly go any further. Then the 20th century arrived, and shattered everything. The first major detonation came in Paris, in 1913, with a ballet by a young Russian composer named Igor Stravinsky. The Rite of Spring established an entirely new musical frontier of dissonance, primitive rhythms, and unfamiliar textures and colors. The premiere famously caused chaos in the audience. The Rite of Spring caused a riot at its very first performance, shocked by its violent, irregular rhythms and crashing dissonant harmonies, a world away from the lush melodies of the Romantic era. Around the same time, in Vienna, composer Arnold Schoenberg was tearing down something even more fundamental: tonality itself, the entire system of major and minor keys that had organized Western music for roughly 300 years. Schoenberg developed atonality and serialism, pushing musical boundaries with new techniques that challenged listeners and redefined what musical expression could even mean. His 12-tone technique structured composition so that no single note or key was allowed to dominate, eliminating the comforting sense of home that tonal music had always provided. From here, the 20th century became an era of relentless experimentation. Electronic music emerged mid-century, with musique concrète and early electronic composition in Germany paving the way for synthesizers and eventually computer-generated sound, a technological revolution that, combined with the avant-garde movement, reshaped the entire musical landscape and influenced genres far beyond classical music. Composers began experimenting with chants, noise, prepared instruments, and entirely new sound sources that would have been unrecognizable as music even a few decades earlier. So in roughly 100 years, Western music had traveled from Beethoven's defiant emotional symphonies, through Chopin's intimate piano poetry and Tchaikovsky's sweeping Russian romanticism, all the way to Stravinsky's rhythmic riots and Schoenberg's total abandonment of key and tonality, the very foundation music had stood on since the Baroque era. Classical music, as a tradition, had essentially exploded into 1,000 new directions. But while composers in concert halls were chasing dissonance and theory, something else entirely was brewing, in the streets, the churches, and the juke joints of America. A new kind of music was about to be born, one that wouldn't need a conservatory at all. Around the same time European composers were detonating tonality in concert halls, a very different revolution was taking shape thousands of miles away, in the cotton fields, churches, and street corners of the American South. And this revolution would end up reshaping global music more than almost anything before it. It started with the blues. No one can say exactly when the blues was born. It's inarguably a Black American art form, native to this country, the product of African captives who became American captives. Its roots stretch back to field hollers, the cries of enslaved people and later sharecroppers working in cotton fields, prison chain gangs, and railway gangs, alongside spirituals and work songs. The earliest references to blues date back to the 1890s and early 1900s, emerging largely from Southern black agricultural workers, centered especially in the Mississippi Delta. Its sound was instantly recognizable. The blue note, flattened thirds, fifths, or sevenths, became a defining hallmark, alongside call-and-response patterns and repeating chord structures like the 12-bar blues. Out of the blues, jazz was born, but in a different city entirely, New Orleans. Jazz developed in early 20th century New Orleans, blending African, Caribbean, and European musical influences. Where blues was raw and personal, jazz emphasized something new, collective spontaneity. Improvisation became a key element of jazz, with the 12-bar blues structure serving as its most important early template. Pianist and self-proclaimed inventor Jelly Roll Morton helped formalize the style, and by the 1920s, jazz had exploded into mainstream American culture, becoming the sound that defined the Roaring Twenties. Decades later, in the years following World War II, blues and jazz fused with country music and gospel to create something entirely new, rock and roll. Rock and roll emerged in the United States in the mid-1950s as a merger of country music and rhythm and blues, and its arrival was less a single invention than a collision of styles. As one historian put it, the formation of rock and roll felt like 4 or 5 avenues rolling toward one another, all at once. Chuck Berry, often called the genre's architect, refined and developed rhythm and blues into the core elements that made rock and roll distinctive, through songs like Maybelline, Roll Over Beethoven, and Johnny B. Good. Around him, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and Fats Domino brought the sound to massive new audiences, and almost overnight, rock and roll became the soundtrack of a generation rebelling against everything their parents listened to. From here, popular music exploded outward in every direction at once. Soul music emerged from gospel and rhythm and blues, channeling raw emotional power through voices like Aretha Franklin and Sam Cooke. Out of soul came funk, a genre that originated in African American communities in the mid-1960s, built around rhythmic, danceable grooves drawn from a mixture of styles popular among black musicians at the time. James Brown turned rhythm itself into the lead instrument, and by the 1970s, bands like Earth, Wind and Fire, Kool and the Gang, and the Ohio Players brought funk fully into the mainstream, while funk grew to carry strong cultural messages about pride, freedom, and unity, especially during the civil rights era. Meanwhile, in stark contrast to funk's polish, punk rock erupted in the mid-1970s as a furious, stripped-down rejection of the increasingly elaborate, overproduced rock of the era, fast, loud, deliberately unrefined, and built on raw attitude rather than musicianship. And in the South Bronx, a new art form was taking shape that would eventually become the most dominant musical and cultural force of the next 50 years, hip-hop. Early hip-hop grew directly out of funk's rhythmic DNA. Funk's grooves laid the very foundation for the birth of hip-hop, with early rap songs built around samples of funk records. By the early 1980s, hip-hop had already started fusing with electronic sound. In 1982, producer Afrika Bambaataa released the genre-defining track, Planet Rock, blending funk and hip-hop elements with the electronic sound of groups like Kraftwerk and distinctive early drum machines. This fusion of funk, sampling, and synthesizers helped birth not just hip-hop's golden era, but entire new electronic genres too. Early innovators went on to directly influence the development of Detroit techno, breakbeat, and drum and bass. By the 1990s and 2000s, genre boundaries had essentially dissolved. Hip-hop, R&B, rock, electronic, and pop constantly borrowed, sampled, and remixed each other, creating an ever-expanding family tree with funk, blues, and jazz still quietly humming underneath nearly all of it. Funk's rhythmic backbone went on to underlie most American dance music of the 1990s and remains a foundational element of Black popular music's rhythm to this day. And now, we've arrived at the streaming era, a moment unlike anything in this entire 50,000-year story. For the first time in human history, virtually all recorded music ever made is instantly accessible, anywhere, anytime, through a device in your pocket. Genre lines have blurred even further. A single song today might blend trap drums, gospel harmonies, jazz chords, and electronic production, often within the very same 3 minutes. Algorithms now shape what music spreads, going viral on platforms most musicians from any previous era couldn't have imagined. So here we are, from a Neanderthal blowing into a hollowed bare bone beside a fire 50,000 years ago, to Pythagoras measuring vibrating strings, to monks inventing a written musical language, to Bach's mathematical fugues, to Beethoven's defiant deafness, to a teenager in the Mississippi Delta bending a guitar string into something that didn't exist before, to a kid in the Bronx looping a funk break on 2 turntables. All of it leading, somehow, to whatever song is sitting in your playlist right now.